It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Gary Tabor. Gary is president of the Centre for Large Landscape Conservation. He is a co-founder of the Australian Environmental Grantmakers Network. He's chair of the US Board for Bush Heritage, and he's chair of the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas Connectivity Conservation Specialist Group. And amongst that, he's found the time to come and speak to us this morning. Thanks, Gary.
Thank you. So I'm grateful to be here. I am a conservation practitioner. I'm a scientist who translates the science that's done at many great research institutions around the world and puts it into the ground in practice. But as they say, in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice, there is. So today I'm going to talk about all the work I do in taking the science of ecological connectivity or connectivity conservation and the policy and opportunities that have come through all this work. So first off, connectivity and the work that I do, I do it in the context of planetary thresholds. And this is bad. If we're going to have the cumulative effects of loss of biodiversity, climate change, pollution, we're fragmenting species, and we kind of look at these problems in segmented ways. But in reality, they all interact, and they all have cumulative impacts, and we're seeing a state shift in the ecology of the planet, and that's bad. Because more than 50% of the planet is now human-dominated, and we're still dealing with major growth in our population and our consumption. And this year, we've seen record deforestation in the Amazon and elsewhere in the world, and sadly, here in Australia, you still have major land clearing. And for a country like Australia to still have this going on, that's very, very tragic. But as our globe deals with this massive fragmentation, it has immense impact on the life cycle of many species. And this paper that came out, looking at mammals in the non-ice continents of the world, showing that mammals are moving less than half than they used to, means that species cannot complete their life cycle, cannot maintain the diversity and important functions that they serve on this planet. And essentially, if an animal can't move, it can't function. And one of the major fragmenting forces on this landscape are roads. And Bill Lawrence at JCU has talked about this a lot. But let me put this into your mind, that in the next 25 years, every paved road that you know on this planet will double. And a lot of those roads will happen in high biodiversity areas in the world, which will have major impact on the ecology of the planet. And the swath of development is going to be huge. Here is a development corridor plan for Kenya to go through the major southern national parks of Kenya. And most wildlife in Kenya are found outside its national parks. And although this is a conservative number and a wrong number, it's still a number that is more the floor than the ceiling. That 100 million mammals, large mammals, are killed by the roadside every year, and Tasmania is no exception, with how many? 400, 500 devils killed every year by the roads here. The biomass impacts of this alone are staggering. And though it came out that 1 million species are at risk, what didn't come out is that 1 million species that interact, that conserve and promote the ecological functions of the planet are no longer going to be with us. Clean water, healthy soils. It's the interaction of species that creates life on Earth. Ecology, interdependence. And when we look at the decline of biodiversity, we've seen this concurrent rise in protected areas, but are protected areas growing fast enough to serve and protect the biodiversity on this planet? Are we effectively managing those protected areas to conserve biodiversity? The trends are not reversing. Now, I live in Bozeman, Montana, which is about an hour north of Yellowstone National Park. And this was the first national park, the icon for conservation for the world. And I want you to notice that Yellowstone is a box. This is a pattern of conservation that's been the model for protected area conservation throughout the planet. But if you think like a box, you manage land, seas like a box, and it leads to perverse outcomes. This is insanity. Species don't stay in boxes, we know that. These are the elk herds that migrate around Yellowstone National Park, and it's kind of like the London tube map of Yellowstone, with each of them having different colors. But basically, Yellowstone itself, the pattern of that landscape does not protect the process that it serves. And so here we are at an ecological conference looking at the future, but one of the futures that I want to impart to you is that, well, GIS came to the fore in the early 1990s and kind of fundamentally changed our decision making. Dynamic visualizations of ecology are going to be our next threshold and going to change how we look at the problems of the planet. For instance, the processes of green up, the phenology of the planet, are now going to be able to be displayed both in time and space. The movement of species as various GPS collars and various tracking devices now get so small, even the smallest wildlife and species can be now tracked, and their movements, and the amount of that data is we're going to understand more about the ecology, the movement ecology of the planet. So I want to give you this premise that much of the conservation that we know from national parks and protected areas comes from the 19th century, 1872, that's when Yellowstone was formed. And then in the 20th century, we expanded that pattern to include the ecosystem, but that still does not carry enough scale to deal with the ecological processes of the planet. And so my premise to you is that this century is the century of process conservation, saving those ecological processes that sustain the planet. And what do I mean by process conservation? Everything from migration to dispersal to resilience to fire ecology to hydrology. All these issues, we protect species so much that we forget about the processes that they serve. And often when we think about connectivity conservation, we think about corridors, how a species like this grizzly bear moves through a landscape from secure habitat to secure habitat through human-dominated landscapes. But the reality is that the World Commission or World Business Council for Sustainable Development, the largest 200 multinational organizations around the world, last year came out with this call to action that connectivity is important, not just for biodiversity, but for sustainable agriculture, because the natural resource base of agriculture is being undermined by not promoting connectivity within ag lands. And so our future in dealing with 21st conservation has to deal not with just protected area conservation, but the matrix. Because there's conservation on all lands and seas, not in just protected lands and seas. And of course, connectivity continues to rise to the top of what you can do, tangibly do, in terms of buffering the impacts of climate change as an adaptation tool. So for all of you, this is my definition of what connectivity conservation is. It conserves the ecological flows, the movement of species, the dynamic processes that sustains nature and thus sustains all life, including us. And if you want a health metaphor, think of connectivity as a circulatory system of nature. We've done very well in protecting the heart and lungs, the organs of nature, but not the circulatory system in a systematic way. And one of the things I'm trying to do with my work is to translate a lot of the science to the public on connectivity. And so I put together these posters for IUCN in all the UN languages about why connectivity is important. And I kind of use the metaphor, it's the safety net of nature. But what is connectivity? You know, where is the field? And so a group of us, colleagues, we surveyed 550 connectivity conservation plans that span about 30 years across the world. We put out a global call for let's see your plans, let's see what the evidence is and the effectiveness of these plans. And we had a selection criteria of what a plan was. And about, of the 550, 263 from 70-some countries came to the fore. And I want to show you that While the science on connectivity conservation has been around for 4 or 5 decades, it's the practice really just started in around 2002. And I think that's because the global awareness of climate change and scale came to the forefront of conservation practice. And then suddenly there was this takeoff of connectivity conservation, led by North America, Europe, and Africa. And at the bottom, and although Oceania is mainly an island region of the world, Australia is a laggard, even though the science for connectivity conservation has been at the forefront in Australia. The translation of that into practice has been behind. And the reason is because Australia has not had enabling policy. And I'm going to tell you that enabling policy is important for the takeoff of idea to action. One of the things that you might see is, well, why is the difference between Europe, North America, and Africa? It's because there's a cultural effect in science. When this practice starts to come out, there's a learning and a translation and a momentum and a diffusion that goes on in the community. And so there's been this feedback loop of doing more and more and others doing it, and that's why North America has taken off, and that's why it's growing in Europe. So having that enabling policy supports this kind of feedback diffusion growth. Now, half the plans that we got, or less than half, were shovel-ready. Plans that had ideas for a specific spot, for a specific corridor, with a specific need in mind. More than half had some kind of vision approach, inspiring a community of action, not really getting into the specifics. Sometimes they were kind of regional connectivity plans, only to be refined as they got into implementation. So we determined 10 factors of success, variables that were strongly associated with success. As I told you, the geography was important because of the culture of learning. Here's the thing about the science. It didn't matter whether you used circuitscape or least cost path or graph theory. That didn't matter in terms of the decision-making of what made an effective plan. It's just that the science was repeatable and transparent. I'm sorry for all the people who have fights over this kind of connectivity science, but just having the science itself and a good base of science is super important. Leadership is super important as well, and this is the role of the NGO community. Governments come and go, but NGOs stay. And what NGOs do is they continue these thoughts through generation of leaders so that it can sustain itself through this variation of government leadership. Partnership, those with more partners were more successful. Those who use focal species were more successful. Funding is always an issue, but funding is derived from having enabling policy. Public outreach, you have to have your stakeholders involved, and then recommendations. I know this is silly, but a lot of plans didn't have recommendations, and those that didn't, those recommendations didn't get implemented. And those that did, obviously were able to show and measure their effectiveness. Now, there are only 9 factors here. The other factor is vision. So in 1993, I worked with a group of Canadian and American conservationists to create the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative. And that is to protect 700 protected areas, state, federal, local, provincial, all the way from Yellowstone National Park to the Yukon to support connectivity between the big, large parks in the Rocky Mountain west of US and Canada. And over a span of 20-some years, we protected, through this vision process, 24 million acres of land, of which 500,000 acres was private land. So it's a huge impact in terms of having a vision. A vision helps. There is no day-to-day vigilance for people who grind it out unless there's a vision out there. One effort that I'd like to highlight is the Washington State Connectivity Working Group, which I thought is an exemplar because they use not just one focal species, they use 16 focal species to determine the connectivity of Washington State's need for conservation. And they were transparent in the science, the state funded them, there was huge public outreach. It shows that these things don't have to happen at the federal level. States can have a major factor in doing large-scale connectivity conservation. But there's national policy going on, enabling policy all around the world, led by places like Kenya and Tanzania, Costa Rica and Bhutan, which all have national connectivity or wildlife corridor acts. Canada right now has something called Pathway to Target 1, which is going to have a Canadian connectivity target in increasing the conservation estate for Canada. The U.S., even though, it's a bitter situation in the environment policy realm for us, there's still bipartisan support for a National Wildlife Corridor Act. And when there isn't any federal leadership, the states and provinces in North America have come together to create their own regional connectivity plan for eastern U.S. and Canada. And at the same time, there have been designations, administrative designations in federal lands for the path of the pronghorn, a pronghorn corridor between Grand Teton National Park and wintering habitat south of the park. But this is funny. A city has come up with its own connectivity plan, Houston. And any of you who know Houston, it is the worst and poorly designed city on the planet. And the fact they are now trying to up their game for conservation and do this through connectivity planning says a lot to the power of connectivity as a restoration tool. And there's also failed policy. And we all know, and maybe you don't know, that there was a National Wildlife Corridors Act here with the last government in Australia and has been stranded pretty much since the Abbott administration. And that's left efforts like Gondwana Link and Great Eastern Ranges kind of groping without this kind of fundamental policy support. So what's needed? This has been an emergent issue, yet it's been ad hoc. It's all over the place. No one's learning from each other. There's reinvention of the wheel. How do we get consistent practice? If we don't have consistent practice, we don't know what we're going to measure. And if we don't know what we're going to measure, we don't know how effective we're going to be with this process. We want to up our game with connectivity conservation. Part of upping the game is trying to figure out what do we mean by what we talk about this. And there's a whole babble of language when people talk about connectivity, from biological corridors to climate corridors, linkage zones, permeability zones. We have to figure out some kind of translation or coordination of this terminology. And when people think about connectivity, they think about their cell phone coverage more than they think about the ecology. But sometimes the two come together, like these raptors that were collared in Russia with SMS collars and racked up $500,000 of charges on their phone bill when they went into Iran. So the Connectivity Conservation Specialist Group was started by an Australian named Graham Warboys, and I succeeded him in 2016. And it is a cross-realm group. We work in terrestrial, marine, freshwater, and air. It used to be solely within the mountains domain, but now connectivity, it stretches across all realms. We have about 800 members, scientists and practitioners in about 80 countries. We welcome more members. We are a support group for anyone doing this work. And one of the compass points for us is ACHI Target 11, which is part of the Convention on Biological Diversity. This target is important because it's one of the few targets that has a percentage, a number to manage by. And that is 17% of the planet on terrestrial areas should be protected, and 10% by 2020 of the marine areas should be protected. And the scientific community has resoundingly said this level of protection is too little. And the I should tell you one more thing on that. And then part of this is that our domain is that not only should we protect these areas, they should be well connected. And what does that mean? Well, Santiago Sora at the European Commission has been trying to figure out, well, what is the effective level of connection? And he's mapped the connected aspects of protected area systems around the world, and it's somewhere between 9 to 12% of those protected areas systems are connected, and that's deemed to be too little. And it's not even been assessed in the marine realm. So what's needed to kind of up this is that right now, literally, when I leave this talk, I'm editing this document that will be presented to the World Conservation Congress, which should be the global guidance for how do you improve connectivity conservation. It's called Guidance for Conserving Connectivity Through Ecological Corridors and Networks. Let me get into it for a bit. First, it defines what ecological connectivity is, the unimpeded movement of species and flows of natural processes across time and space. The element here is what a corridor is. What is the connective feature? What is going to connect have a connective value in the matrix. That's not a protected area. And we're defining that as an ecological corridor. You could call it a connectivity area, a linkage zone. The reason we're using corridor is because policymakers around the world have adopted it. It's not the right scientific term. It's just that it's the term that policymakers use the most, and we're trying to leverage where policymakers are, not necessarily where the scientific community is. And when you put these things together, these connective elements with protected areas, you get a network. You get large-scale ecological networks. And this is the framework to do this. So common language, figuring out the spatial component of ecological connectivity, how it integrates science and policy. And the conceptual model is, and I'm sorry that the corridors are narrow, we don't intend them to be that, they could be as big as the blobs on the map, is that you're going to connect protected areas and these new things, if you haven't heard about them yet, they're called other effective conservation measures or conserved areas. The world is classifying things like military bases that have a lot of ordnance, that essentially function as strict nature reserves, are conserving biodiversity just as well as a standard protected area, and they should be classified in serving biodiversity goals. And so if you connect the protected areas, these other effective conservation measures, with this new designation corridors, you should have the building block for ecological networks. Just to recap, protected areas and these other effective conservation measures or conserved areas, their primary goal is to conserve biodiversity. But because we're trying to create some kind of voluntary ground-up designation within the matrix, the goal for an ecological corridor is to conserve the connectivity value, which can be seasonal and can be patchy and doesn't necessarily require a full-on protected area status. So it does not have to conserve biodiversity, but it has to conserve the connectivity value. And so we will have guidance for how you nominate these efforts. And in Australia, you might have stewardship agreements or covenants, so forth. We need new tools to conserve this value in the conservation matrix because we can't designate everything as a protected area. And of course, we have to figure out how to measure this. We're going to need an index for connectivity. And so right now, there are 3 different indices out there that I feel create a proximate portfolio for effectiveness of connectivity. One is Simon Ferrier's work on resilience that comes out of CSIRO. The other is Santiago Sora's work called Protected Connected, or PROCON. And then this new one for freshwater systems that Grill and all have come out from Canada. So the conversation is 50% of the planet nature friendly? This is the conversation that will happen next year in both Marseille and in China and in Gujarat, India. How much the conservation community, the scientific community says we have to do more to protect nature. There are several efforts like Nature Needs Half and Half Earth, which is E.O. Wilson's thing. Believe it or not, these 2 efforts don't talk to each other, but if you did put them together, they'd be one Earth. You have National Geographic's 50% of the planet by 2050, but you get the idea that we're not protecting enough. Now, while we do want to protect the most intact large areas of the world, the boreal forest, the Amazon, most of the world is fragmented. And the only way we're going to have this large-scale response is by having a connectivity solution to the fragments. So you can see this is the architecture for large-scale conservation. So 2020 is the year of action. Many strategic plans over the next 10 years for the Convention of Biological Diversity, the Convention of Migratory Species are going to be written. This is the forefront of ambition for conservation so we can save this planet. And of course, we can't forget that the efforts that fragment nature, like roads, rails, linear infrastructure, need to be dealt with as well. And there's been so much great thinking on green infrastructure for buildings, or even open spaces, but we don't think of it for roads. And roads have been a laggard with regards to greener thinking, how they're placed in the ecology, what materials they're made of, how do you mitigate their impact on biodiversity. This is a forefront that has not been dealt with because Rhodes people are linear thinkers. And let's just, and finally, I want to get to another aspect of connectivity, is that while I've been talking about connectivity from an ecological sense, patch to patch, it's also in connecting these different jurisdictions, these different geographies, you're connecting people. It's just a byproduct of the work. This is what you have to do. It's a people-oriented focus. Let me just share with you my conceptual framework of a landscape. Because a landscape is the interaction of people, places, and you can call places patches, and species. And this interaction is supported by connectivity, whether species and people. You could think of that interaction as coexistence, the interaction between species and places as resilience, and certainly people and places as sense of place. But connectivity is at the core of this landscape unit of conservation. And so there are socio-ecological corridors. The nomadic Hadza, the Bushmen of Tanzania, who never stay in one place, who aren't cattle grazers, they depend on ecological corridors to sustain their culture. And there are many cultures around the world, even here, that depend on this, not just from a wildlife or biodiversity standpoint, but from a cultural standpoint. And then when you look at the ecosystem, there's connectivity as well. Now, in my backyard as well is Waterton Glacier International Peace Park, the first peace park in the world, and it's where Glacier National Park in the next 25 years will lose all its glacier. That means the water table, the water buffering, the resilience of that ecosystem is going to change, and it's going to change at a large scale. We have to connect all the stakeholders in that region to figure out a plan of saving not only their backyards, but saving their cultures and livelihoods. So we created a roundtable of all these interests to come together to figure out how to deal with weed management, water management, a wildlife conflict, because wildlife ecology is going to change, interactions are going to change in this landscape, and prepare for the future at scale. And this is how it works. We really have all these different interests at the table trying to figure out how to work together given that the environment is shifting underneath their feet. And it began sort of with a network analysis of when you start connecting people, you build social capital. So ecological connectivity gives you social connectivity, which builds social capital. And we can map this over time. And this one effort is just one of 450 such efforts in North America, because everyone is trying to respond to the scale question. No institution, no landscape, no owner can deal with the scale of this problem. People have to work together. There's not enough money. New solutions have to be found. So there's this bottom-up upwelling of collaborative conservation. And each of those dots could represent an effort that's almost continental in size, like this Eastern Wildways effort of the Wildlands Network. So they're overlapping, these efforts are nested, but they're growing, and it didn't require some kind of government intervention, only in the sense that it required general policy support that this kind of bottom-up collaborative conservation is supported. And it's growing around the world, and I haven't been able to map how many there are, but to date, I've been gathering about over 150 of these large-scale seascape and landscape efforts that are overscale, working with hundreds of organizations, thousands of communities. And if you think about it, there's going to be no top-down solution to climate change. It's how we work together and connect each other across landscapes. I've been grateful to learn about what's been going on here in Tasmania with the Midlands, and we'll take that message to all the other landscapes, in other parts of the world. But if you think about it, we're going to save the world by connecting these landscape and seascape efforts one at a time. Now, one of my goals in the Connectivity Conservation Specialist Group is trying to communicate connectivity to a broad audience. I have a 1-minute video that I'm going to end with here that was done by BBC Photographer of the Year, Jaime Rojo, for the Connectivity Specialist Group, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you all.
Now, I think we've got time for at least one question, if the microphone... Yep, we've got a microphone ready, so... Just David down the front on this side.
Thanks very much, Gary. Really interesting information about connectivity on land, and at the risk of asking you to give another talk, can you tell us just a little about what connectivity means in the oceans and how we manage it?
So the Connectivity Specialist Group has a marine working group because connectivity in the marine realm is even more complicated because it's more of a three-dimensional world because of the water column. And it is behind the curve with regards to terrestrial of what's going on. But there's some really exciting things going forward in this arena. First of all, marine protected area systems need connectivity. Isolation, by and large, does not work because the size is so important, especially seagrass connectivity. Coastal marine interconnections are vital. The other element that's really exciting are these swimways. You may have seen this pelagic swimway between Galapagos and Cocos Islands in Costa Rica. And we're finding out these important corridors for pelagic species are vital for marine health. And while we've always focused mainly on upwelling areas in the marine systems as key nutrient areas, these swimways are pathways of life for species. So, part of my talk here today is trying to recruit more science and more investigation in this realm. It's by no means baked, this whole area. We need more, and in the marine realm especially.